Welcome back to another episode of Behind Beliefs Behaviors. I'm Dr. Maisha, and I am very excited to be back. I took, at the time of this recording, a little bit of time off from recording to go on vacation. And so, for a little self care. But I'm excited to come back because we're living in a very interesting time right now. And it is a time where excitement is high and tensions are high and fear is high. And it reminds me of a conversation that I was recently having about what motivates people in leadership. And so, as I was talking to this client of mine, we were talking about the motivation of leading with the carrot versus leading with the stick. And essentially, that the distinction is leading from fear and leading with fear versus leading from empowerment and leading with empowerment and understanding and emotional intelligence. And I talk a lot about emotional intelligence, but I want to talk a little bit about what is it that makes leading from fear and leading with fear unsustainable. And I language it the way I do because I said leading from fear. That's one thing, but then leading with fear is another. And we're going to distinguish that. So when I talk about leading from fear, it's the place from which you lead. It is where the leadership, where the actions come from. And oftentimes, when we're in fear, there's something that we're either afraid we're not going to get, we are afraid is going to happen, we're running away from, we're wanting to avoid something happening. And when we are facing the direction of what we're avoiding, we're not facing the direction of what we want or what we're striving to get. So that is the first thing. Leading from fear, from the place of fear, keeps you focused on the thing that you don't want. Now, if you've listened to me for any amount of time, if you've seen any of my talks, I often talk about this reticular activating system in our brain. And this little reticular activating system is the part of our brain that wants to match out in the world that internal representation or that internal picture that we're forming in our head. It seeks to create a match, to create congruency. And so if we are constantly focused on what we don't want, and our attention is focused there. So when we're leading from fear, we are leading from the place of what we don't want or what we're trying to avoid. And our attention is focused solely on what we're trying to avoid, not what we're trying to accomplish. All right. And so imagine the reticular activating system is focused solely on what you're trying to avoid. Your attention is solely focused on what you're trying to avoid, and you're leading from that place. What do you think you're going to produce more of? What you're trying to avoid, because you're not even focused on what you want. You can't take the actions based on that. You're taking the actions consistent with getting away from. All right. And that's why I often say that anti campaigns or being in a space of anti doesn't always work, because the anti is solely focused on what we're against, what we don't want to happen, or what we're avoiding. Now, here's the other space of that. When we're leading from fear, we're focused on what we don't want, then we are operating in a higher stress state. We're operating from in a space of hypervigilance and in a space of toxicity, and that activates our survival responses. That activates our threat detection centers, and it increases our cortisol. And then guess what? We make worse decisions because it interrupts our capacity to think. It interrupts our capacity to see different perspectives, to take perspectives. It interrupts our capacity to to make effective decisions, to communicate. It interrupts our capacity to listen when we are solely operating from fear. right? And so when that's happening, we are not making the best decisions anyway because we're operating from fear, we're operating from avoidance, and we are not operating based on what our vision is, what we want to see, what we want to accomplish. So, in essence, if we're continuing to operate from fear, if we're continuing to lead from fear, then it is not sustainable because we are eventually going to burn out. You burn out leading from fear. And that is why it's not sustainable. And that's why it doesn't work as well. And the other piece is even if you're taking the actions to get away from, you will only take actions so much as so the thing that you're trying to avoid is far enough away so that you're comfortable. And then you tend to take your foot off the gas and then we backslide. Once again, why anti campaigns or anti spaces are not as effective as toward spaces. So let's look at now, we're talking about leading from fear. When we lead from fear, we're also more likely to lead with fear. Okay, what do I mean by that? We use fear as a tool to motivate others rather than using vision and possibility and empowerment as a tool. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Right. So when you lead with fear, and let me tell you, I grew up in a home that was led by fear. And I now understand that's because that it was led from fear, right? So when how you do anything is how you do everything. And if you're leading from fear, you're more likely to lead with fear because that's what you know. But when you're leading with fear, when you're using fear as a motivator, which is a lot of what marketing does and media does. I mean, if you notice, if you ever watch the news, I try to minimize it as much as possible while still knowing what's going on in the world. But if you look at the media, if you look at marketing and advertising, how do they attract people? By playing on their fears, right? So they lead with fear and it does what it does is it keeps people in hypervigilance, just like it keeps the leader in hypervigilance. And it activates those threat detection systems. And yeah, they may make decisions, but those decisions are not the clearest decisions because they're based on trying to run away rather than running towards. And of course, that's what marketing and media is counting on, by the way, right? This is spin. This is why spin happens. And so in organizations, and you could say in communities where there are movements, we can say in families where we're trying to have our children move in a certain way or influence our spouses. Leading with fear doesn't work because it activates that, once again, that survival response, that threat detection system that causes us to make decisions, rash decisions that are not well thought through without context. Again, it interrupts our ability to listen, to communicate, to perspective take, to put context around certain circumstances. It interrupts our ability to think clearly and actually see the bigger picture. Once again, perspective take. And so when you're leading that way with others, you're not providing an effective ground for them to be their best self in their work. Speaking in organizations and communities now, right? You if you want the best work from your team members, from your organizational your employees, your leaders, then when you're leading from fear, that is not a sustainable way to have them bring their best selves. And that is where mistakes and errors happen when a person's in hypervigilance, when a person is in fear. That's when the details get missed because we're running away from something and we're rushing to do something right or perfect out of fear. And so it's important to understand this concept because what happens is when a leader leads from fear and with fear, not only they burn themselves out, but they burn their teams out and they burn their communities out. And so what's needed is to lead from a different space. Lead from an empowered space, from a disciplined space, from an organized space, from a space of providing safety and trust, from a trauma informed space, to lead from a space of empowerment, and to lead from a space of what's possible. Because when you're leading from the space of possibility and when you're leading with the space of possibility, then once again, if we talk about the reticular activating system, then you're actually looking at what you're wanting to accomplish. Your attention is focused on what you want to accomplish. That's not without understanding and knowing what you want to avoid. It's not without understanding and knowing what you're wanting to get away from. It is with the primary focus being on what you want to accomplish, not to invalidate what's so and what we're working to dismantle. All right. I'm using very intentional language here. And so when you're looking at leading from possibility from within, and you're looking at leading with possibility and empowerment, that is transferring that into the people whom you're leading, your employees, your team, your children, your family members, your spouse, your community, in movements, what works is actually keeping the eye on what's possible. And that creates movement because when people are focused on what's possible, they get excited. There's joy, there's this positive energy. And guess what that does to the body? It lowers the cortisol system. It creates more bonding and more connection. And when we're bonding and when we're connecting and we're creating community, then that increases power. And we're more likely to be organized when we're in collaboration and when we're in lockstep. And so keeping that eye on what we want to accomplish, on the goal, on the vision. And even when we reach that vision, then we'll continue moving forward because that blossoms and expands into the next vision. And more creativity and more ideas and more innovation comes out of possibility and empowerment and the ability to provide equity and the ability to be organized and to think critically and clearly, the ability to take different perspectives happens inside of leading with and from possibility. And so you get a faster and more effective and more cohesive and more organized result when you're leading with possibility, when everyone's leading from possibility rather than leading from fear or acting or moving from fear. So I wanted to bring that context because I think it's important to understand the distinction. And when we're talking about organizations, this is extremely important because we know that when you lead with fear, and this is just fear, I haven't even talked about integrity, I haven't talked about trust, I haven't talked about safety, right? All of those components have to do with whether the leadership is where the leadership is coming from, right? But when you're leading with possibility, and then you add in integrity and transparency and identity and psychological safety and emotional intelligence, what you do is you empower your teams and your leaders and your employees with what's possible. And that is what increases and maintains engagement. That is what begins to create more of an inclusive environment. That is what brings in more loyalty to organizations. And again, the creativity and innovation happens inside of that. And so I was speaking with someone earlier, we talked about how these concepts of things like cultivating cultures of trust and safety, how in a non-healthcare space, they're not entirely new. I've done a couple of engagements with organizations here and outside of Atlanta talking about psychological safety. And this is something that they're actively in conversation about, creating cultures of trust and safety. And on the flip side, my background is in medicine. What I'm noticing, and I just did an engagement with Wellstar, amazing engagement, amazing group of people to engage with. And what was shared with me is maybe they felt like they might have found a need they didn't know they had. And inside of healthcare, I think that is the case. I think as healthcare executives and healthcare leaders, and even as physicians and nurses and advanced practice providers and respiratory therapists, as I understand, physical therapists, all of the healthcare professionals, creating trust and psychological safety inside of these organizations is likely a need that you didn't know you had. And so we need to, especially in health care, in an industry that has historically conditioned us to be everything but emotionally intelligent. I'm speaking very transparently here as a physician who's grown up in that system, who has not promoted psychological safety, has not been really great about cultivating trust within organizations and amongst colleagues and leadership and attendings and students, was not historically been great about focusing on emotional intelligence. This is an area that is definitely ripe for growth. So, with that said, I just wanted to share that this is the time to begin to think about how do we begin to lead from empowerment and possibility rather than lead from fear? How do you do that? This is the question that I'd like for you to ponder. I'm always about giving the reflection, the homework, the opportunities for growth. So, how is it that you can then begin to inquire whether you're leading from fear, whether you're leading with fear, or whether you're leading with and from possibility and empowerment? And how will you then look to doing the latter in order to cultivate that space, that culture of trust and safety, and expand what's possible with your movements and your organizations and your teams? So that is the piece of thought to chew on throughout the week. And share this episode, share it with a friend, share it with a family member, share it with a colleague, because as we begin to focus on this and build organizations and build communities where people feel seen, heard, respected, and valued and welcomed, then organizations and everyone in it, and communities and everyone in them can grow and thrive. And if this is a conversation that you are like, wow, I'm leaning into it, and you're a leader of an organization or a leader, or you're part of an organization, and you're like, you know what, they need to hear this, then I invite you to invite me into a conversation of how can we work together. All right. And so with that, remember to subscribe to Behind Beliefs and Behaviors, because these are the kind of conversations we're having, both solo conversations and also with guests, around how do we begin to improve and expand our culture. And with that, I look forward to the next time that we see each other. Again, share this information with a colleague, a friend, a family member, and leave a review, leave a comment, and let us know how you like this particular topic and what you thought was valuable about it. And if you want to reach out to me to schedule a call to explore working together, then you can go to mindremappingacademy.com right here on your screen, and we'll have that in our show notes. And so until the next time we see you, stay empowered.